So I think all of you will agree one of the toughest turf grass areas to manage is sports fields. This is a picture of our UMC football field. So we have Saturday home games every couple of weeks, and you'll see the years vary from 6 to 5 home games. On Friday nights, we have high school football games. We have intramural sports on this field, which has been extremely challenging. We have our own intramural field that we, as a turf program, put in the irrigation system too, but they choose to use the football field because it has surround sound. So they like to put in their music and play music while they're doing intramurals. We also have the high school track and field that come over. And yes, okay, they're supposed to be on the track, but they wallow. That's a good Alabama term for you. They wallow in the grass quite a bit. And we also have a series of camps over the summer, so you won't be surprised to see that there's a little bit of compaction and firmness at the start of the system because of that. So how to get folks interested in maintaining the field. So our grounds and facilities department is that. We don't have a designated grounds crew just for athletic fields. In fact, they take care of the entire campus, both inside and out. So lots of times you'll see them moving chairs and tables early in the morning and literally go out and mow in the afternoon. So how do you kind of change that dynamic? Well, we all want to provide a playing field that's safe for our students and especially our athletes as well. And so we don't want to be blamed for any injuries, especially if they end their time playing a certain sport. We don't want to be responsible for that. So trying to encourage them to think about safety first has been challenging as well. So we do have some maintenance checklists that are out there. Many of you probably use the STMA one that I'm going to show you in just a minute. But it's based on turf grass quality visual ratings. So, for example, you want a good turf grass quality, excellent turf grass quality, but we're not looking below the ground. We're only looking at the above ground. And, of course, the below ground affects the up ground or above ground turf grass quality. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. It's a great place to start. And, in fact, for many years, I tried to encourage our grounds crew to use this first as kind of a way to decide what they needed to do each week in preparation for the game. The problem is, as there's a lot of things going on that field, there's a lot of things going on campus, and so they're kind of pulled in many, many different directions. So this is an example kind of blown up of the playing surface for natural grass from the STMA football soccer checklist, and you'll see that most of it has to do with coverage, turf grass coverage, and also has to do with uniformity and density and overall health. So it's very visually based, and what you're observing above ground is being affected by what's happening below ground. So we want to make sure that we add to this checklist to determine what's going on below ground. So some of the things that we need to take into consideration for turf grass quality as it relates to player injury is traction, hardness, and evenness. So traction actually becomes a really big issue for us right now, and you'll see that as the presentation goes on, because that has all to do with soil moisture. Okay. Hardness, we're going to look at surface firmness and compaction. And then, of course, evenness goes into that visual quality. What's the coverage? What's the uniformity? And what's the turf grass density stand like? So I was contacted by our athletics department. They were concerned about the quality of the football field. This was 3 years ago, and wanted to see if there was something that I could do to kind of help. So how do I do this? It's just me. I'm the only soils and turf grass person on our campus. So I thought this would be really interesting to involve the students. And most importantly is they need to learn about these dynamics that occur. I feel lots of times right in the middle of things, they use me against one another. And what I mean is athletic fields or the athletic department and grounds and facility. My job isn't as a consultant, but I do that just to try to improve things. And so They will literally take things that I say and kind of manipulate things. So I wanted them to be able to see that dynamic. So we had the coaches come out for the football field and kind of describe to the students what their expectations were. Of course, we have expectations of not only the coaches, but players, students, the community, because high school football games are played on this, but we were just trying to kind of see what the expectations were for the coaches at first. And another side note is that UMC is the very first laptop university. So we're the very first institution to give out laptops to all of our students. And so we are really technology driven. And in fact, all students at UMC have to take a technology course before they graduate. So it's very important that we try to use a lot of technology, gadgets, tools, if you will, what's in your toolkit kind of thing. So they all have experience with those gadgets before they leave the university. So we'll be using a compaction meter. You'll see later on a turf firmness meter, a chlorophyll meter, and so forth. We'll also use a soil moisture meter as well. Early on in this process, we were also taking soil samples. So you'll see the students taking soil samples for a checklist. This is something that would take too long to do. It took them about 2 hours to take soil samples from across the entire field. Then they have to take that back into the lab and dry it, or weigh it, dry it, and then reweigh it again, and then do the calculation. So because of time, we only have an hour together. And because this takes too long to do for a pregame safety checkpoint, I'll kind of go over that, or not talk about that today. So we looked at soil compaction and soil moisture. Initially, this was just supposed to be for a lab, but you'll see in the pilot study we ended up taking data on 6 of our home games in 2016. And so we basically divided the field into 3 areas, which we called West, Central, and East. And the center of the field is actually from hash mark to hash mark, so it's a little bit wider than what the picture depicts, if you will. So for every 10 yards, we took a diagonal reading. So there's 6 readings across this diagonal of the 10 yards to get a representative sample. Looking back, this is probably really ambitious. That's 180 samples in a 2-hour lab period, and not something that I would suggest that you do, but this was all about lab and getting them used to it. And also keep in mind, each student is using the equipment. I wouldn't recommend that either, but they're all getting a chance to use the equipment while we're out there. So they were using a soil compaction meter. This is the Field Scout SE900 soil compaction meter. And out of all of the instruments that we use, the compaction meter takes the longest. Anybody ever used this before? So you get a lot of putting the probe down and a lot of misreads. So it kind of slows you down a little bit as well. So over the time, the students got more experienced and we could kind of speed things up. I'll show you on the tables and graphs, but essentially what we're looking at is PSIs from the cone index reading of 300 or higher to indicate compaction. What you can do on a sports field is then determine the percentage based on the number of plots, and so you'll see that as well. Most everybody has accepted the use of a volumetric water content meter. It's a VWC, volumetric water content, a soil moisture meter. I was already using this in my research on the golf course. It's just a tool everybody should have at this point, and it's based on what your soil type is. So on our field, which is not ideal, is a silty clay loam. That's what it is. That's what we have to deal with. And so we can figure out, okay, what's saturation, what point of saturation, what's field capacity, and what's wilting point. And for us, you'll see from the diagrams that we are lots of times saturated, which is going to cause problems with player safety, specifically traction. You'll see in a little bit. So I've kind of broken it down for you because that graph is hard to see. Basically, anything higher than 41% is saturation, so I'm going to usually use 40% because that's easier to memorize. You don't really have to memorize the other ones because you'll see that our field is very saturated. So this is after the first home game. This is for compaction readings. And you'll see right in the center of the field, I don't think anybody's really surprised by this, but the center has PSI values greater than 300. So actually the center of the field is 100% compacted after the first game. And you might ask yourselves, well, it's the first game. Well, remember, this is the first time that we're actually seeing data, okay? So we're actually having to kind of talk back and forth with grounds. They weren't quite prepared when the season started. But if we take the whole field and count up the number that have those plots that have greater than 300 PSI, about 50% of the field is actually compacted. But most importantly, that center part is compacted. So we talked to them. We decided we should go back and see what it looks like after the second game. So now our numbers have increased. Again, the center of the field is completely 100% severely compacted, but the total field is now 87%. So again, we talked to them. You need to get out there with airifier. Let's go. Come on. Let's do this. So we decided we'd go out again. Right? We'd get to the third. And again, we have compaction, not as bad, but you'll see this is going to correlate with the moisture readings. Okay? So it's 70% of the field is compacted. So we're waiting. Come on, guys, let's do this. We get to the fourth game, and it's just crazy, right? 80%. And the center of the field is back to really compacted. And my students kind of joke about this. At the end zones are really high, which we're not the greatest football team in the world. We're definitely not the Gophers. So you can kind of see that in these plots. Okay, so finally we airify. And we can see that the numbers are significantly lower. We don't have anything in the center of the field that's 300. There's one little spot here, one little spot here again. So less than 10% of the field has any compaction at all. You'll see this also corresponds to moisture, which is kind of interesting as well. So we felt like we accomplished something. But if we're going to make recommendations to the group, then we need to see what happens in our last game. So the last game, we come back and we're at 53% again. So we're increasing again, and we're kind of dancing around that 300 PSI mark for the cone index in the center part of the field. So it's not enough just to do it one time, essentially. And you know, kind of thinking back to golf course management, you know, you're lucky if you get them to airify one time in the fall, one time in the spring. On sports fields, it's really important to address the soil underneath and think about doing it as often as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of what they did towards the end. So real quickly, just on the moisture, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want you to see some trends, if you will. It's basically everything that's 40 or above is kind of this periwinkle or darker. So we have saturation on the fields. What's interesting here is the drain is along this west plot line. So you'll see that continuously going to be more saturated than the other areas. Where we had the lowest compaction readings is the highest saturation. So if you ever read one of the guidebooks for using the compaction meter, it says make sure that you take your readings right after a rainfall, right? So your numbers will be less, but we still have compaction. So we know that water is kind of an issue at this point. We just didn't really know how bad it was until the follow-up. So we asked them to aerate the field every 2 weeks. And looking back at that, that's a little bit laughable because it took so long to get them to get out there and aerify. And keep in mind, it's nothing against them. They are doing everything on this campus. They take care of the entire campus inside and out. So they are doing what they can when they can. And so we asked them to decrease the irrigation based on the moisture readings. But again, kind of funny because I'm the only one that has the moisture meter. So I have to kind of make sure that my communication with them is going forward every time we take readings. And we asked them to run a uniformity test on the irrigation system. That never happened at this point. So we decided to come back in 2017. And before this, we sat down with grounds and made sure we kind of went through what they should be doing. And we had those difficult conversations about, when they can get to it and whatnot. So we come back and we decide, okay, we start talking with sports rec management department. They found out what we were doing and thought, okay, well, maybe we should see if we can assess some of the player injury. So that department got involved, and so we talked with the trainers before the season started and basically figured out a way to ascertain if the injuries that were happened were field-related. And then they would report back to us what those injuries were, especially if they were field-related. And so we gathered that information both on the football field and now the soccer field. So we've just doubled this study, if you will. And so we took away the soil sampling part of this project, and we added canopy greenness with a chlorophyll meter and turf firmness with a firmness reader. And I'll show you pictures of those in just a second. And so we had the soccer field. So everything's the same for the football, but we're just adding 2 more readings. So time-wise, this is still taking us 2 hours. We're still taking 6 samples every 10 yards, over 30 plots. But we're not taking the soil samples, so we can get it done in about 2 hours. On the soccer field, it was a little interesting to try to kind of figure this out. So we divided it very similarly, but we also wanted to take a look at the goals. But what's interesting about this field is that it's a renovated field. And more importantly, the soccer field is the practice field and the game field. Okay, so that's going to become important kind of later on in this discussion as well. So we're taking the same readings, and this time we're using the chlorophyll meter. So very important, you're going 10 yards. It's really hard to do quality on a large area like that. If you're on a 25 square foot plot and trying to determine turfgrass quality rating from 1 to 9, you can compare that plot to the plot beside you. Oh, that's a 7. Oh, this is a little bit greener. This is an 8. When you've got such a large area, it's really, really hard to do that, especially with students who don't really get the whole 1 to 9 scale to begin with. And there's no consistency. So we use the chlorophyll meter to do that. And then a little bit of debate on this particular firmness meter. It's mostly used on golf courses. But remember, our whole purpose is using technology and using something that all the students will use at some point in their career. And we already had one, so it made it easier to use. But basically, the hammer's underneath, so it's set to a certain height every time. And so this has been dropping the hammer down. And what you're looking at is how far does it penetrate the surface in inches. Okay, so the lower the penetration value, the firmer the turf is. So lower number, more firmness. And so again, we're doing compaction, we're doing moisture. And so here's the first information on the soccer field. A little bit surprising. I mean, we're not in the 300s except for this area over here. But I was a little bit surprised that it was in the 2s in some of these areas. So interesting. The moisture readings, again, anything above 40 is going to be saturation for a silty clay loam. So then on games, the second game, third game, and fourth game, no compaction in the hundreds. But what was interesting well, I should mention moisture, still saturated. But the firmness meter is starting to pick up areas, and this is before the third home game. So this may be kind of an early warning type of gadget to use to see that you might have some problems. And really, it's a lot faster to use. You're just dropping the ball and keep on moving, where the compaction meter takes a little bit more finessing, if you will, to use it. As we kind of go towards the end of the season, we see that the compaction is starting to increase. And then by the end, this is the firmness. So all the gray areas are firm. And also to note, as at the end of the season, the goalies are completely compacted as well. So even though we're not picking so much up with the compaction meter, we're definitely starting to show firmness with the firmness meter. Okay, so this is the ranges for the field and then the goal areas. And I don't want you to get bogged down in numbers. We're looking for trends. So as the season progresses, these numbers get lower. That's not surprising. And one thing we need to make sure that we're telling our turfgrass managers is almost like what we tell homeowners. Don't stop. Don't get tired. Keep going. We've got a whole season. Keep your cultural practices going till the end of the season. And so we're not seeing as much with the compaction meter, but again, we're starting to see it with the turf firmness. Colors the same way. We start off in the 9s, 0.9, and by the end of the season, we're 0.8s. But again, a lot of these round up to 0.9. So we're just looking for consistency and uniformity when we're using the chlorophyll meter. So the injury data was collected by the trainers. So the students themselves had to tell the trainers what happened, and then the trainer decides if that's field related. And so we see that we've got 3 injuries in game 1, an injury in game 4, and an injury in game 5. And this lines up to the agronomic measures that we've been taking over the course of the semester, because I was surprised that we had a little bit of compaction here at the beginning, and things just kind of get a little bit worse over the course of the season, if you will. Football field, game 1, we're at 77% compaction. So again, the center of the field is compacted, 100% compaction. But they aerified, so they did listen to us. It happened a lot quicker this go around. But by the 4th game, we're back again up. So that's showing us that it can't just be done one time. We've got to start doing it as often as possible to be able to reduce the compaction. Now, what's showing up now is that instead of showing you a bunch of graphs, you'll see that from game 1 to game 7, we seriously have a drainage problem on this field. And so this is something that's going to come up later on as something that we need to have addressed. The question is it just the football field or is it the soccer field as well? And from the previous pictures, it's the soccer field as well. You can see with that one game, game 4 being 90% compacted, the firmness readings are really low as well, meaning that the field is very firm. So we have a connection here. Again, the firmness meter may be an early indicator, but it also correlates with the compaction as well. Color, again, is decreasing over the course of the season, so need to make sure that we're looking at those quality readings. From the STMA checklist would be a great way to do that, to improve overall color and health of the growing grass. So with injury data for football, it's not surprising that we had compaction. So we've got some injuries here at the beginning of the season. And then when we come back, we've aerified in here and come back, and we're starting to get injuries again. And so making sure that they're working throughout the season is our goal for the future. So after this 2017 year, we really sat down with both groups and talked about the injury. That's when things started to change for us, is when Ground started looking at the injury list. they were concerned. They didn't want to be blamed for any injury. So that's really what got their attention, if you will. And so we started to be more active and trying to improve the quality of the field. So in 2018, I summarized everything into one table here. You'll see changes. This is the football field, which we've had problems with for the past 2 years. We don't have any compaction. We still have the moisture issue. We're going to come back to that. And the firmness readings are high. We're just in this one area have 40% firm. Now this ND is no data, and that's because for the first time in the 3 years, we've had a snowstorm right before Game 3. We also had a snowstorm right before Game 5. And you'll be able to compare this in a moment with the injury data. That becomes another question for us in northern Minnesota that my parents talk about being Canada, is the fact that what do we do after these snowstorms? And that needs to be something that we address. We weren't able to take data because they didn't remove the snow till the day of the game. And you'll see that it'll be a complaint of some of the players at the end of the presentation. So we weren't able to get out there and do the data, but we still took the injury data. So over the course of this year, we didn't have any compaction, but we're starting to pick up some firmness in the center of the field, which could be an early indicator that we're starting to get some compaction. This is prior to the 4th game, so we've just had a snowstorm. So this is a picture of the field. And if you kind of go back to thinking about the STMA checklist, one of the things at the very bottom of this list is really no evidence of mechanical equipment on the field. Well, we got tire marks everywhere. And that's because they had to scrape off the snow, literally. So the field, you can actually see some of the lines in there. The field doesn't look that great quality-wise. And we're asking these students to play on this field when we know it's pretty firm. And so we can see that the injury, there was one injury during that game, and then the other snowstorm, there was another injury during that game, and there was one right after. What's interesting, though, is what's the positive from this? We go from 2017 of having 10 injuries down to 3 in 2018. And that was really important to point out to our grounds and facility that the things that they're doing are making a difference, right? That's going to promote them to try even harder. For the soccer field for this past year, again, we don't have any compaction. Again, moisture is the problem. Firmness isn't too bad, but you can see that right after this snowstorm, quality really decreases quite a bit. So these are just some pictures that we were able to take when we went out and took data before. So we've got some snow still remaining. The whole field just looks like this. You'll see the goalies, and you'll actually see tire marks there in front of the goalies. So what's the answer? It's the end of the season for them. How do you make up a game? Is it safe for the students to be out on this field at this time? All of those questions need to be addressed, and that's not me to make that decision. That's going to be our athletics department working with grounds, and that's the key, working with grounds. For example, last summer, I was at the British Open and got a phone call about the soccer field. I'm literally not there. I can't provide any input, but I'll take a look at it when I get back. And when I got back and went to grounds and told them the athletic field wanted me to look at the soccer field, they didn't want me to look at it. So there's this dynamic that's occurring, and I'm the middle person, right? And they're both trying to use me to get what they want, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But so this is the injury data. This is the games where we had snow. We didn't get data, but we had 4 injuries. And that is a problem because we didn't get to take data. There's 4 injuries occurring. What do you do before or after snow? Okay, so to the survey, we actually got a pretty good response. We had 49 athletes, 11 soccer, 45 football, 3 trainers, and 4 coaches. And we just kind of asked them in generally at the beginning, what is their perception of the field? And 44 say poor. So we're doing all of these things below ground to reduce compaction and reduce firmness, surface firmness or hardness, but the quality still isn't there. So that's something that we definitely need to address. And then what was a little bit difficult was, did they see a difference between 2017 and 2018? Well, we have a very, very high turnover of athletes. They get to northern Minnesota and they don't like the weather and they end up transferring. So we didn't get as good as responses that we were hoping to, but 17 said no and 8 said that yes. And it's a question of, do they really know that the field's changing, or they know that we're out there? So what is the perception? When they see us out there, they know we're doing something. What I thought was really interesting is their suggestions. So these are mostly students that are making the suggestions. These are the common ones, so I listed them here. Improved drainage. Well, that's an absolute problem that we're having, is we're completely saturated. That causes traction problems, and that leads to injuries on the field. So that has got to be 100% addressed. Lowering the mowing height, that would help speed things up, but a higher mowing height masks a lot of problems, quality problems. And so any of you that have worked with football coaches, they can raise or lower depending on who they're playing. That doesn't happen so much on our field because they wouldn't be able to do it that quickly. But when you get into soccer and baseball to some extent, it's going to affect ball roll. Clear the fields more quickly after snow. Out of the 3 years, this 2018 was the year that we had 2 snowstorms during the seasons, and we didn't really know what to do. I know that sounds surprising being in northern Minnesota, but we've never had 2 snowstorms. In the past, if we've had a snowstorm like that, then they would reschedule the game to another field, and that would be synthetic turf or artificial turf. So there's that question. God love these kids. Putting a heating system underneath. Well, they just think we're rolling in cash, right? That one made me giggle. Level the field, recrown the field, resurface the field. Definitely needs to be done. But you'll see that that's going to be a complication in a minute. Decrease irrigation before practices. What? The irrigation system's on before a practice? That's something that we definitely need to investigate. I don't know if they're just confused that it's wet and they think it's being irrigated. But the football field is irrigated. The soccer field is not. Doesn't have an irrigation system. So something to think about. Definitely need to improve the turf grass coverage. I think that kind of got lost in this study a little bit because we're concentrating so much on the below ground. No high school football games, that would be great, but the university actually gets money from the high school to pay for maintenance on the field. So that's a political and monetary issue. And practice field for the soccer, this actually is a conundrum, if you will, because the soccer players could use the intramural field as a practice field, but that means intramurals on the football field. So it's kind of a vice versa. The soccer field is actually irrigated. The turf program put in irrigation heads onto that. So it's a possibility for them to use the intramural field for their practice field. Okay, so we wanted to be able to quantify the relationship between the agronomic and risk assessments to lead to strategies that would improve our athletic complex, if you will. And of course, those then would lead to decrease player safety, player injuries, right? We want to decrease player injuries. So our recommendations are, again, to aerify every 2 weeks. Now, this gets to be like one of those sit-down conversations on what kind of equipment do you have and whatnot. So our grounds, they like to use solid tine instead of hollow tine. You could probably guess why, because they don't want to pick up the course, right? They've got too much to do. The other thing is a silty clay loam. So just having them mulch up, mow over the course doesn't really solve the problem. Where saturated silty clay loam, it's just going to kind of go back into those holes, right? So I have tried the conversation of top dressing, and that gets really, really complicated. They don't like the idea of adding sand to a silty clay loam, even though that would help with infiltration of the water. So that's an educational moment for me to be able to kind of explain the properties of sand and infiltration of water and whatnot. Now, will it really help with the overall drainage? That would be a huge question, and hopefully they'll give us the opportunity to be able to do that. I did purchase hollow tines for them, trying to encourage them to use hollow tine, because one of the things that I'm really worried about is a hard pan starting to create. If they're punching that organic material down to a depth every single time, they're punching that material down into an area where microorganisms may not be as active. They're more active further up in the profile. And of course, as the season goes on, especially in Minnesota, that microbial activity is going to decrease, especially towards the end of the season. So trying to get them to vary the depth, it's really important. And trying to get them to use hollow tines, I mean, that would be a win for me, for sure. Now, how do you get them to use technology and gadgets? Well, at this point, we'd be sharing gadgets themselves, but sharing that information, maybe being able to put the information online that they could see it more quickly instead of having to have that conversation every week. Would be more beneficial. It's really, in the end, it's a communication issue between myself and the other two groups. What I didn't expect from this is kind of using the information from the pilot study where grounds wasn't actively doing a whole lot. I mean, they finally did aerify at the end of the season, and then start of 2017 didn't start so great, is that athletic department is using that information to promote synthetic turf on the field. So for me, being a turfgrass professional, that's kind of a hard pill to swallow, only because that is a learning laboratory for our campus. We don't have our own golf course like the Twin Cities does. We just have our athletic field complex. And for us to be able to take labs to golf courses, we have a 2-hour window for a lab. We're in the car for an hour. This athletic complex is home for us to be able to do a number of labs. So we don't want to really see that change. And we're trying to make things obviously better for everybody around. One of the things that I was kind of hoping was that the students could be involved with the renovation of the field. But that gets really, really tricky weather-wise. So if you think about the football field, for example, you'd need to be ready for fall, right? So you got to start doing something. Ideally, you'd start a year in advance on renovation. But you're looking at the end of spring to be able to do something, and would you be ready by fall? So when I mentioned that the soccer field had been renovated, it was just, the surface. They basically just killed off the existing grass there, tilled it up. No drainage was put in, no irrigation system was put in, so I don't want to misrepresent being renovated, if you will. So I feel like they're using the renovation as also a push for synthetic. It's like, well, if we already have to renovate, resurface, recrown, put in drainage, why should we put in grass again? Why not use synthetic? The other component to this is UMC is a sustainable campus. So we're tree huggers or grass petters, if you will. And so we're trying to promote everything sustainably, sustainable development and whatnot, and all the information out there, the pros and cons of natural grass versus synthetic grass, that argument's going to go on for a while, and we're not going to debate it here, but that's something that we constantly have to kind of think about as we kind of go on with this project. So in the end, what brings the sunshine is the fact that there were so many people involved over the past 3 years that you can only hope, and we've seen that player safety is important and injuries have decreased, and still trying to figure out a way to make sure those injuries keep decreasing. So everybody's aware of player safety was one of the goals of this project. What I didn't also expect is that we have quite a number of students who are interested in sports turf, and they're basically athletes. And so they said, let's do this on the baseball field. Let's see what it's like out there. And the baseball field and softball field are actually maintained by the students. So you're starting to get a picture here. So if our grounds and facilities is for the whole campus, they're really putting all their attention onto the football field, and then they've put a little attention on the soccer field, but that's because we got a new coach. But they really haven't been doing a whole lot to the soccer field in the last 2 years, but the data shows that things are getting a little bit hairy if they don't do anything about it. So the baseball and softball field is actually taken care of by the students. And so for fun, they convinced me to go out here and do the project on the baseball field. And so what's interesting is the infield for soil compaction is higher than any of the other areas. And it was quite funny because Graham Cherry's a pitcher for UMC. The entire class turned to Graham and said, quit yakking on the infield. That's what y'all are doing. Y'all are just standing out there yakking. That's not the place to yak. Get off the infield, right? And we can see that the surface firmness is lower than the other areas. Moisture is, again, a problem. And I would say out of all the areas, the baseball field's the worst. And if you manage baseball fields, you cannot have standing water on the infield. It's just more work for everybody. You'll see that the color is a lot less for the baseball field, and this is the same time as the fall 2018 data. So you can kind of tell just from the color that it's not as well taken care of as, say, the football field, which gets students really riled up, especially if they're athletes. What I thought was really interesting is I used to play softball when I was little. So I thought it was interesting kind of looking at the left field, center field, and right field. It's the right field that's the prettiest or the less stressed, if you will. And I guess that makes sense. I'm a right-hander, so when I used to hit it, I always was like left field and center field, right? Unless it was just some crazy ball that hit off the tip. I wasn't going into right field. But what's interesting is for baseball fields, if you're in a stadium and you're looking down, you're not going to see uniformity in this situation. All the field is not going to look the same. So you have to kind of manage the different areas differently so everything looks uniformly at the end. So we have Graham that I mentioned before. Him and another SRM student, they just wrote a little grant and got $3,000 to fund this part of the field from administration, which is, we have a new vice chancellor, which I think is positive. He seems to be really interested in trying to help as much as he can with trying to improve the fields. And so this spring, they're going to actually start taking data during their season. And their season is really weird because of the weather. It's basically February till the end of May, especially if they make the playoffs.